The left-wing mob is trying to demolish our heritage so they can replace it with a new repressive regime that they alone control.
You're going to have to get tougher. You can't be politically correct anymore because we're really fighting something that's very dangerous.
While President Trump warns his supporters against what he calls the radical left, his critics accuse him of using divisive tactics as his poll numbers continue to drop. Hello and welcome to Inside America. I'm Ghida Fakhry. It's a moment of introspection in the United States as statues and symbols celebrating leaders of the Confederacy, the southern states which fought in the Civil War to maintain slavery, are being debated or toppled. Mississippi became the last state of the Union to remove the Confederate emblem from its flag. Princeton University dropped the name of U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, the father of the League of Nations, from its School of Public Policy because Wilson was, quote, a racist and can no longer be a role model. Meanwhile, President Trump signed an executive order to protect federal monuments and statues, instructing the Justice Department to give priority to the prosecution of people who damage these monuments. The president has faced heavy criticism for retweeting a video of Trump supporters in Florida as one of them shouted white power.
Where's your white voice? Where's your white voice? Racist. White power.
Following an outcry from Democrats and fellow Republicans, Trump deleted his tweet. Meanwhile, social media companies are facing mounting pressure to ban hate speech, with major companies withdrawing their ads from Facebook, which announced last week that it will start removing posts that incite violence, including those from political leaders. Civil rights groups have long accused social media companies of enabling the propagation of hate speech and offering a platform to white supremacist groups. Critics of President Trump also accuse him of supporting, either tacitly or explicitly, some of their ideas in an effort to prop up his base ahead of the November elections. So then, how does the Trump campaign respond to these accusations? I'm joined by Jenna, Ellis, senior legal advisor for the Trump campaign and an attorney for President Trump. Jenna Ellis, President Trump has been threatening those he calls anarchists and leftist mobs, threatening them with 10 years in prison for throwing paint on monuments and trying to deface them. What is the president trying to achieve by taking on activists who want these symbols gone and by signing an executive order to protect these Confederate statues?
Yeah, well, first, it's really these not protesters but anarchists that are destroying public property, and they are defacing these monuments, and they're the ones that are undermining our American history, and so they're the ones that are actually threatening the people around them. They're threatening, there's been a lot of violence. And so what the president is doing is restoring law and order and making sure that these criminal activities are punished to the fullest extent of the law. So his executive order was reinstating and making sure that these anarchists would be brought to justice because we have to have a law and order in society to make sure that criminals like this are punished.
But the destruction of public property, as you rightly say, is already covered under the penal code. The president didn't have to sign an executive order, did he? He didn't have to direct his DOJ, Department of Justice, to implement the law. Is he simply pandering to his base? Is he simply trying to appeal to the right, far-right extremists among his base of supporters?
Not at all. And I don't think his base of supporters can be fairly characterized as far-right extremists. They're people, like myself, like I think anyone in a well-ordered society that loves the law and order, that understands that in order to have a well-ordered society, we need to be able to enforce our laws. And so this executive order was specifically directed toward the actions that these violent criminals and terrorists are going around and destroying these public monuments rather than going through the process. If they want these to be taken down, then there is a process to appeal that through the government, through the proper and appropriate authorities, rather than simply going and defacing them and removing them and causing that type of harm.
But as you say, there is a legal process in place that the president doesn't have to wade in, does he? It's much more than preserving heritage. It's much more than preserving law and order, isn't it? I mean, when the president himself retweets a video of one of his supporters shouting "white power," it sends a message, doesn't it? A clear message.
Well, and that was very clear through Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany, that the president didn't hear those exact words. I'm certain that we all understand that as we're scrolling through Twitter, there are things that we share that we may not necessarily hear or see everything contained in that video. He did delete that video, so I don't think that it's a fair characterization at all to say that that was something that was intentional or was in any way trying to promote that particular language. And so what's going on here,
you say he didn't hear the message. You say he didn't hear what was said in the video, though it was just 8 seconds into the video, Jenna, Ellis. So any objective observer cannot but conclude that there are not so subtle messages being sent. And
not at
it
all.
is not the first time that the president of the United States feigns ignorance.
Well, not at all. And again, he is a human being. And I think that for anyone who is a prolific Twitter user like he is, I think that that's an entirely fair and rational explanation of that particular tweet. And, the press secretary said very firmly that he simply didn't hear that portion of it, which is a reasonable and very fair explanation. And I think that it's the mainstream media that's trying to take that out of context and paint him in a way, and again, you start this segment by saying these are protesters, these are activists, but no, these are violent criminals that want to deface and tear down American history. And this is a president that's standing up for law and order.
Well, that's what you call them. That's not what they call themselves. But having said that, looking at the context, as you say, of some of his tweets,
they are.
When the president,
they are defacing these statues. They're tearing them down. That is in America a criminal activity. So we can agree that they are criminals.
Leaving that aside, though, when you talk about context, the text that President Trump accompanied with that retweet reads this: "The radical left, do-nothing Democrats will fall in the fall. Corrupt Joe is shot," in reference to Joe Biden. Isn't this a blunt message, a call to some of his supporters to act on their worst instincts against the people the president has been demonizing for so long?
Not at all. And I think, again, that's that type of question. I would absolutely refute the premise of that question, because what you're trying to do is paint the president in a certain way that simply an objective observer who's looking at this president, what he stands for, which is the rule of law in America. He stands for the U.S. Constitution. He stands for the measurable difference between right and wrong. That is what criminal law in any society is ordained and established in order to fulfill. And so to try to paint him and characterize him in a way that is negative in order to purposefully tell your audience that he is somehow either a white supremacist or he's against peaceful protest, I think is very unfair. And so
not at all. I'm asking you. Not at all, Jenna. I'm asking you, Jenna, hold on. I'm asking you what kind of message the president sends when he sends tweets like he did as well just in the last day or two of a couple pointing guns at protesters in St. Louis. Why does he amplify these messages if he does not identify with the content?
Well, and that's a question, that I'm not going to step into the mind of the president, but what I can tell you is that he is a president for law and order. And when he is saying that they're the do-nothing Democrats that are promoting a leftist, progressive, Marxist worldview, if you actually look at what the Black Lives Matter as an organization stands for, they are for the complete and total destruction of the family, of the church, of well-ordered society. And that's what we're seeing here. This isn't just a movement of people that are peacefully protesting, that are against, racism, which of course we would all condemn. They have a much more nefarious motive here. And so what the president is amplifying is his message that he has repeatedly tweeted of law and order, and making sure that, again, that measurable difference between right and wrong, that is what criminal law is designed to fulfill in a well-ordered society. You have to have law enforcement to enforce those laws and to make sure that criminal activity is punished.
All right, Jenna Ellis, Senior Legal Advisor to the Trump 2020 campaign. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
As President Trump warns against the far-left Antifa, a loose anti-fascism movement he accuses of fomenting violence during recent protests, a far-right extremist group known as the Boogaloo is beginning to raise red flags. Sporting Hawaiian shirts and assault rifles, Boogaloo members are showing up at protests and rallies and say they are preparing for a second civil war. On Friday, Attorney General William Barr ordered the establishment of a task force to counter what he called anti-government extremists, naming the Boogaloo and Antifa as threats. Although there is little evidence that Antifa members were behind recent acts of violence or looting, federal prosecutors have charged 3 men with ties to the Boogaloo movement for planning acts of violence at protests in Las Vegas. 2 others were charged in the drive-by shooting of a federal courthouse guard in California. Now, meanwhile, the U.S. State Department released its annual terrorist threat assessment, saying the threat posed by, quote, racially or ethnically motivated terrorism, particularly white supremacist terrorism, remains a serious challenge for the global community. In February, New Jersey was the first state to formally designate white supremacist extremism as a leading terrorist threat. The state's Homeland Security and Preparedness ranked homegrown violent extremism and white supremacist extremists highest among terrorist threats in 2020. Daesh and Al-Qaeda were ranked lowest. So are right-wing, neo-Nazi and white supremacy groups gaining momentum in the United States? I'm joined by John Farmer, who has been closely studying the Boogaloo movement. He is the former New Jersey Attorney General and director of the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers University. Professor Farmer, the state of New Jersey has recently compiled data on domestic terrorism threat. What does the data tell us? Is the threat mainly coming from the radical left, Antifa, as the president often likes to say, or is it from groups like the Boogaloo on the far right? And how finely defined are the lines between these different groups?
Well, that's an excellent question. And the data really show that the primary violence has been committed by the far right extremists to date. But that does not mean that the far left is not also involved in vandalism and attacks on police. So there's a dark space where the two extremes meet, and that's the space that really amounts to anarchy.
You say it's a dark space, but is it enough for President Trump to be tweeting constantly about Antifa? Here's a recent tweet in which he said the United States of America will be designating Antifa as a terrorist organization. He has condemned the group for acts of domestic terror. Is there specific evidence linking them to any violence? And how much of a threat do they really represent?
Well, you know, the two left and right are sort of different when you analyze the data. So that groups like the Boogaloo Boys, who are sort of a far right libertarian Second Amendment group, they're very tightly organized and easier to sort of track over social media. The left wing, there's no sort of Antifa organized tightly group. What Antifa tends to be, I think, is a very loose conglomeration of all kinds of left-wing beliefs, some of which may turn violent, but the degree of, we don't see the same degree of tight organization on that side that we do on the militia groups, on the groups like the Boogaloo Boys.
But if the Boogaloo Boys advocate violence against law enforcement, as they do, would you expect U.S. officials to mention them more frequently? Some of the data in your own state, the data that was put together by the New Jersey Homeland Security, shows that out of 44 domestic terrorist attacks, 22 were carried out by white supremacists. Does this include the Boogaloo Boys? And why is there no sense of urgency then at the federal level?
I think the federal government is starting to wake up to the reality of this threat. I participated last year in a working group under the Homeland Security Department, where we basically, under the leadership of General John Allen from the Brookings Institution, basically tried to get their attention on the emergence of these right-wing extremist groups. And the administration has been slow to recognize that threat. I think they can't avoid it now, because what's happened in the last few weeks is that people affiliated with some of these groups, including the Boogaloo Boys, have actually killed people.
And you mentioned John Allen, who was in charge of US and NATO forces in Afghanistan. He has said that some of these domestic groups on the far right should be labeled terrorist groups. And there is currently a petition that's been circulating that has garnered more than 2.3 million signatures that is calling on the federal government to label the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, as a terrorist organization. Do you support these calls, and should the same apply to the Boogaloo Boys and others?
Yes, I think the attention has to be paid, and has been very slow in coming to these right-wing extremist groups. To date, the real serious violence that has been committed has been on their part, not on the part of the so-called left-wing terrorist groups. So I do think the time is overdue to look closely at these right-wing militia and Boogaloo Boy types groups, and to label them for what they really are emerging to be, which is a terrorist cells. They use the same kind of tactics and messaging that terrorist groups use. They identify martyrs among their group and emphasize those people. The hostility to the police is something that's really contagious, and they're trying to exploit the current legitimate protests. And this is where I would fall both left and right-wing extremists.
But does it mean that they all have similar aims, that they should all be lumped together? Because just recently, in the last few days, the Attorney General, William Barr, put out a memo which said, although these extremists profess a variety of ideologies, they are united in their opposition to the core constitutional values of a democratic society governed by law. Some pretend to profess a message of freedom and progress, but they are in fact forces of anarchy, destruction, and coercion. Do you agree? Can we lump them all together? And how much coordination is there among these groups, and certainly between them and neo-Nazi groups like the Base, like the Order of the Nine Angels, like the KKK?
I don't know how much coordination there is. The social media provides a vehicle for all these groups to interact with each other in ways that they probably couldn't before. But I think each one has to be looked at individually as a group to identify what their real ideology is and what their true targets are. He's correct. I think the Attorney General is correct that what unites a lot the left and the right ultimately in the most extreme fashion is the just hostility to the rule of law and the advocacy of violence against any kinds of law enforcement or any institution that represents stability in the rule of law. And so in that sense, their means may be identical, but I think if you're looking to basically learn more about them, you have to really study them as individual groups.
But as you say, they do organize online on Facebook and other social media platforms. Facebook just recently saying that it is going to start taking measures against affiliates of these groups under a lot of pressure, and under pressure of many major organizations pulling their advertising from Facebook. But is it going to be enough? And how tricky will it be to target them online without infringing on their First Amendment rights to free speech?
It's a very difficult constitutional issue, because you don't want to stifle the free expression of ideas, particularly when you have people with legitimate grievances that they need to express. What's interesting in studying the social media activity of these groups is that it escalates to a point, and then almost invariably when it reaches a certain pitch, people start acting out, and so the social media discussion becomes real world reality. And the trick for law enforcement, the trick for the government is, and frankly for all of us, is not to allow these groups to hijack legitimate conversations, but at the same time, not to intervene so quickly that you abridge people's rights to free speech. These are tough issues, and they require careful judgments and sober assessments. And I think that's what's been lacking, frankly, in the discussion to this date.
They do indeed. Professor John Farmer, former Attorney General of New Jersey, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
As law enforcement works to eradicate violent racist extremists online and on the streets, what happens when hate-filled speech appears within the police force? Earlier this month, 3 North Carolina police officers were fired after a review of a patrol car video found the officers making racist comments. In the video, one officer said, quote, "Society needs a civil war to wipe them off the map," and discussed, quote, "slaughtering black people using a racial slur." Meanwhile, 4 police officers in San Diego, California were placed on administrative leave last week for allegedly posting racist and anti-Muslim comments on social media. As police departments across the US try to push ahead with reforms, can they root out racial discrimination in their ranks? Joining me now is the president of the Major Cities Chiefs Association and Houston Police Chief, Art Acevedo. Chief Acevedo, you said in the wake of the police killing of George Floyd that it created an awakening Yet you also said that there was no systemic racism within police departments. But when you see, and that it actually saddens you when people look at race, you say we have to look at the actions of individuals. But when you see repeated evidence of violent racism against Black people, can you deny that there isn't a pervasive problem of racism within the police department?
There's racism in society. There's racism around the world. Racism is not limited to police departments. There's racism and discrimination across the spectrum. Think about this. We have 800,000 police officers, 800,000 police officers in the United States on 18,000 police departments. If only 1%, just 1%, were what I call knuckle draggers, people that are racist, that are biased, that are abusive, that's 8,000 police officers that are not doing the right things for the right reasons. Then you add the fact that we have a proliferation of cell phone cameras and public safety cameras and ring cameras, and the chances are they're going to be captured on tape. There is no context in terms of when we do something wrong, racist, brutal. No one's talking about the tens of millions of times when we do things right. So I'm not going to deny there is racism, because there absolutely is. There's bias. There's police brutality. But I also know, having been a police officer for 34 years, that if we had all the technology 34 years ago to capture the stuff that was happening back then, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation now, because I believe we would already fixed policing. So there's a lot.
Well, I'm not so sure. I mean, you still say, Chief Acevedo, that it's just the 1%. No one is suggesting that all police officers are racist, but is it really a case of just one or two police officers, one or two bad apples? Isn't there a more sinister reality that many police chiefs know, that is a rather well-known, well-kept secret among police departments, and that is the fact that there is support among some law enforcement officers for white supremacist ideology? That's been well documented.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Look, we just had in our own department right here, in this minority majority department in the most diverse city in the country, we had a cadet early on in the academy admit to another cadet that he was a white supremacist and he couldn't wait to go out and do harm to people of color. Well, needless to say, that person was fired immediately, because the cadet that he told that to came forward as required by our policies. So don't get me wrong, there are significant issues with policing. But
that's one case, Chief Acevedo. But what's being done on a more systemic level? Because as you well know, the FBI has for many years now quietly investigated the infiltration of white supremacists within police departments. In fact, as you know, there's a 2015 classified FBI counterterrorism policy guide, which says, quote, that domestic terrorism investigations focused on militia extremists, white supremacist extremists, and sovereign citizen extremists often have identified active links to law enforcement officers. And of course, this follows another FBI warning in 2006, which raised the alarm over, quote, white supremacist groups' interest in infiltrating law enforcement communities. Has anything at all changed in the last 15 years?
Yeah, I think what has changed is that we've been able to actually look at a lot of our applicants' social media, being able to dig much more deeply into not only what they do, but the circles they run in. And I think that as a result, we've been more successful in actually weeding out people that have no business being police officers. But sovereign citizen movement, constitutionalists, people that might be even white supremacists or part of hate groups, they permeate society across the board. And that's why we have to continue to be vigilant. We have to continue to make sure that we do thorough backgrounds, and we have to continue to make sure that we as police departments across this country keep an eye on what people are doing, because when they do raise their head, sooner or later, they're going to raise their head, and we have to make sure that we detect hate, detect racists, detect white nationalists, or any other type of hate group. So the number one threat right now, one of the biggest threats to our country right now, is violence from right-wing extremists. That's a fact. It's a bigger threat than the extremists on the left. But at the end of the day, whether you're extreme right or you're extreme left, your reasoning may be different, but they're both extreme, and you're out of touch, and we all need to come to the middle and start working together to make this country better.
Chief Art Acevedo, thank you so much. Great talking to you.
You're welcome. Take care.
And so while law enforcement in the US is trying to address biases within its own ranks, the racial and ideological tensions across the country are increasingly palpable. They can no longer simply be swept under the rug or blamed on a few rotten apples. But this crisis has also heightened tensions over questions of race and identity. The growing acrimony and fear of violence in a country awash with firearms and armed militias is real. Although the Department of Homeland Security had warned back in 2009, after the election of the first African-American president, of the resurgence of right-wing extremism, that prospect has indeed materialized. It is now plain for everyone to see. The KKK may no longer be leading the charge, but white supremacy is still alive and well in an increasingly ethnically diverse country. So, in short, although President Trump did not create this awakening of the far right, it is under his presidency that these movements have come out of the shadows and have felt liberated to spread their message. Trump's own messaging is no longer subliminal, if it ever was. It may have worked for him in 2016, but might not in 2020, when America is reckoning with its tormented past. Let us know what you think, but for now, from me and the entire team here in Washington, thanks for watching.